afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. We're beginning with the end today, specifically endings of popular TV shows. Spoilers, for we're talking about endings, but we promise not to give away too much about the ending of your favorite shows, we hope. The question we want to ask is, what does the ending of your favorite fictional narrative say about your personal politics? Do you prefer an ending where evil is punished and good triumphs? Or do you wish for more ambiguity or maybe even melancholy? Our guest today has studied endings, both good and bad, and has how those penchants can predict one's worldview. Jack Gierzynski is the chair of Political Science Department at UVM. A few years ago, he taught a class that studied the popular TV series Game of Thrones to find out if people prefer happy endings to sad and why. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on. Thanks for your interest in my research.
Absolutely. And why don't you first tell us what got you interested in doing this class?
Well, I've long taught a class on media and politics, and we look a lot, and political scientists examine the impact that media has on people's political perspectives. And my discipline, political science, focuses mainly on news, public affairs programming, and its effects on people's views about politics. And it became clear to me after several decades of teaching the class and studying this issue that there are a lot of political messages out there in entertainment that could affect people's views about politics that we as a discipline aren't paying attention to, and actually no other discipline was really paying much attention to. And the notion, and that comes from the notion that people think they select their entertainment the same way they select their news based on their politics. But there's an awful lot in entertainment that we're not really aware of how it's going to play out and how it might actually shape our views. And the ending side of things is a great example of that.
And was that decision at all informed by a 2000 study by Marcus Appel that kind of looked into that a little more?
Yes, and some research work I did in graduate school as well, looking into this notion that people have this propensity to see the world on a continuum of it being a just world or not just world, if you would. And Marcus Appel's research showed that our propensity to like things to turn out well in our entertainment, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, that's how we like it, the happy endings, that could actually have an impact on our belief in a just world, making us more likely to believe the world is just than someone who, say, pays attention to the news. And again, this is not something we're aware of, that this is doing it to us. And that belief in a just world doesn't sound very political, but it actually is. Because if you believe the world's just, if you believe bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people, you're less likely to be supportive of government action to help people out who suffer from misfortunes. And so it has a powerful impact on politics, but it's really subtle in terms of the way our stories present it. And I don't know if you want me to go on about Game of Thrones.
Oh, we can dive into that in a little bit.
Okay.
It sounds to like the untrained ear, myself in this case, that it's almost about psychology as well, but this is mostly a focus on political science, is that right?
Yes, it's about, political science is a multidisciplinary discipline. When we arrived on the scene, we tended to borrow from a lot of other disciplines that have theories about people in general, and then we focus on that aspect as it relates to politics. So I draw heavily on some theories from psychology about how our mind operates when we're consuming narratives or stories. The argument is we're transported into the fictional world in a way that leaves our mind in a state that is not likely to, say, counter-argue political messages that we come across, especially if they're subtle political messages. So that's the foundation of my work. But what I'm focusing on in terms of the attitudes and beliefs, those are very political, and that's how it's political science, but borrowing from psychology in terms of its theories. We also borrow from communication studies and sociology, anthropology, a lot of other different disciplines. But the idea is, do these things affect people's views about politics?
And now tell me how Game of Thrones kind of is a good example for this.
So Game of Thrones came on the scene. There were a number of different shows that started to kind of violate that just world narrative for, people want a happy ending, and kind of in your face that no, the world's really not like that. And Game of Thrones was so popular. I had actually started watching it and stopped watching it in some, but my students encouraged me to go back to it, and that goes to the fact that, why we watch shows. A lot of times our friends or people in our circles that encourage us to watch it. And it really struck me when I went back to it that it was related to this belief in a just world that I'd studied earlier, but that it was so in your face, the opposite of most stories. For the first 4 seasons, it was just brutal. And most people can tell you about the Red Wedding. That just sent people into unbelievable shock. That it really, again and again and again, it was showing a fictional world is not just in any way. So the question in working with my students was like, well, what do you think effect this has on people's views about whether the world's just or not? And so through a number of different studies, we decided to look to see if it shifted their views about justice in the world. And we did some experiments, we did some surveys, and the finding was indeed that exposure to the shows seemed to make people less likely to believe in a just world, which then the statistics show were related to those more direct political views about support for government programs.
And one of the things that we think of when watching TV is maybe escapism, kind of getting out of your own life, but did your studies kind of find that that's not actually what people are looking for when they choose their media?
No, they are looking for escapism, although research in communication studies has shown that some people, there are a lot of different motivations that lead people into entertainment media. And sometimes people want more serious subjects, and they're willing to see things that are a little more disturbing, if you would. This ties into, say, the people who watch HBO's Euphoria show, which was an incredibly disturbing show. I actually had a piece published on that as well, on the impact of that show on people's attitudes about drugs that I did, once again, with students, a student project. Although our samples in these are not students, our samples are research subjects 18 to 25 or whatever that we get nationally. But there are, some people are motivated and are willing to see things that are a little more difficult. But the other avenues into it are, friends, people talking about it on social media, friends talking about it. That really brings people into shows where it might make them uncomfortable, but they'll stick it out because they want to be part of the conversation. Everyone's talking about it. And that's when these outcomes can have an effect.
And can you point to a show that's a good example of a fair ending?
A fair ending or a happy ending? I would say most TV shows, they wrap things up nicely, happy ending. We were talking earlier about Battlestar Galactica, that has, trying to avoid spoilers, but that has an happy ending. Star Trek kind of shows, sci-fi. I'm kind of focusing on those because the other dimension of this is a notion of fantastic displacement. When we're watching like the Game of Thrones or House of Dragons now, or sci-fi, it's not set in our world, so we suspend disbelief even more, and we're really sucked into the reality of that show. Because we prefer these happy endings, and going back to Powell's work, just in general, he just looked at entertainment shows in general, and with the knowledge that they all tend to wrap things up mostly nicely. In recent years, in the last decade or so, there has been a trend away from that. People are more willing to watch more disturbing shows or things that don't turn out well, or where the bad guy doesn't have the comeuppance, if you would.
Sure.
Yeah.
And how about reality TV? How does that fit into this framework?
Reality TV is really interesting. A colleague of mine did some research on the impact of, say, rags to riches reality TV. And she demonstrated that it has sort of a similar effect, but it leads you to believe in economic mobility when you watch those shows, and that totally contradicts the reality of economic mobility in our society. So you come to believe that people can pull themselves up out of their own bootstraps by watching these reality television shows. That was a really good study that she pulled off on that, and some really strong findings as well.
Yeah, maybe more hopeful than the truth.
Yeah, a little more hopeful than, say, Game of Thrones. But and again, it's kind of happy endings. Like, oh, if you work hard, you can, you can succeed, and those shows really imbue that attitude, even though if you look at the actual statistics on economic mobility in the country,
It's not the case.
It's not exactly.
Sure. And is this concept transferable to books and movies as well?
Most definitely. And a lot of that has to do with, in essence, the power of stories. Well, that's what I'm talking about. We know the power of stories, like that, and that it can have an impact in a lot of different ways. And what I've tried to draw my discipline's attention to is that it can also have an impact on politics. It can affect smoking behavior, has been demonstrated, or drinking, or whatever, but and racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, and those are. And my point is that carries over into the political messages, because we're so transported into the stories. We buy the reality of the stories. The concrete images of the stories are hard to counter-argue. That happened. That's the reality. So we don't tend to do that when we're really enjoying a story, when we're immersed in it. And it makes stories actually have a potential to have a much larger impact than, say, the news these days. Because when people go to watch the news, their defenses are up, and they're processing it cognitively in a very different way than they process information. Well, they don't really process information when they're immersed in stories.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. And that's the end of our program for today. I want to thank the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX who always make for a happy ending. I'm Julie Whitney. Have a good one.